Here's the matchup. Accelerate on the outside. City of Light toward the rail. City of Light puts away Accelerate with 1/8 of a mile to go.
Number one, the race is gone from 16 to 12 to $9 million. Interesting enough, they took the other $7 million and decided that they want to make a turf race, mile and 3/16, the Pegasus World Cup turf. And I believe, as much as I love and cherish European racing and believe it is extremely important in the grand scheme of things, I think at the beginning of the year, anointing a turf race at a mile and 3/16 for $7 million is probably not the right move. Obviously, the race will grow. There are going to be horses funneling out of the Breeders' Cup, and hopefully even those who don't come from, let's say, over in Europe, from the Arc de Triomphe to the Breeders' Cup Turf or the Mile, some of the graded, the big races, the Queen Elizabeth II, and the subsequent grade ones prior to Arc Weekend and Champions Weekend at Newmarket, which includes the Champion Stakes at a mile and a quarter, and the QE2 prior to all that, these races at Ascot, you're hoping that you'll get horses that, whether they go in the Breeders' Cup or not, after Arc Weekend, Champions Weekend, a lot of them go to the Japan Cup and, of course, the big races at Hong Kong. The likelihood that you're going to get horses like that, whether they go to the Breeders' Cup or not, participate in the aforementioned two big racing festivals, to run in the Pegasus turf is something you're hoping for. But right now, it's only been run one time, so we don't know the future of it, what kind of horses will funnel in. Because we all know the American horses, even though they're good, it doesn't have the sex appeal that the Pegasus World Cup does, being on the dirt. Now, the biggest problem with this purse is that $7 million. It's definitely, to the Stronach group, it's not a problem. It's, if anything, it's an eye-opener, a lot like the Dubai World Cup when it was created at $4 million by Sheikh Mohammed and his conglomerates. But I think the problem is that $7 million is a little bit too much. What could be done are a couple of things, and you might find this interesting for all you fans out there at the CS Racing Report. You could take, first of all, the Pegasus should be an even $10 million race. Instead of being 9, take $1 million of that 7 that's left over, make it a $10 million race. Take the remaining $6 million and do a number of things. One, you could have 6 grade 1 races, whether it be the current races on the card for that day or newly created races, 6 grade 1 races at $1 million a pop. You could do it that way. You could have 2 grade 1s at $3 million, or you could have 3 races grade 1 at $2 million. And what type of races you want to anoint is to be determined. And of course, we'll talk about that maybe perhaps in another podcast. And then last but not least, go back to the original draft, the original blueprint of $12 million, and then have the remaining $4 million go into a turf race like the Pegasus, like what's already set up, like the current setup at $4 million, which would match the purse of the Breeders' Cup turf. Now, some would say, well, it doesn't really create a slogan or an incentive or an eye-opening incentive for it to distinguish itself between the Breeders' Cup. At $4 million at the end of January, somebody's going to show up for that kind of money. You can believe that. So $4 million and $7 million, obviously the difference is $3 million, but I really believe that taking that purse distribution and just putting it to the Pegasus World Cup makes a lot more sense. But what really, for those who don't think that makes a lot of sense, that it's just an overpaid situation where each owner has to put up $1 million, that's the innovative wrinkle to it, is the second point of contention that I'm getting to, and that is the distance. At $12 million, it should at least be 1.25 miles and be that much more of a rich race statistically than the Breeders' Cup Classic. At 1.25 miles, this is where races like the Clark, races like maybe the Native Diver, could even be up to 1 mile and 3/16. The race may even be a little bit shorter than what it was for years and years, 1 mile and 1/8. That, of course, you fans can correct me on in the likes and comments department. But what's interesting is what I think would make it more compelling in the lead up is that those aforementioned races are going to be more interesting if you ramp the Pegasus up to 1.25 miles. That's very, very important to do that. So I think that's what needs to happen when it comes to the distance. The 1.1 miles is just not the classic distance, and I think we've already lowered the bar a couple of decibels enough to begin with, starting with the Breeders' Cup when it was invented. Remember, the Jockey Club Gold Cup was the change from 2 miles to 1.5 miles, and for years and years a great standard bearer at the 12 furlongs as the championship event. Once the Breeders' Cup came in 1984, the Gold Cup for the first few years of the Breeders' Cup stayed at the 12 furlong distance. What should have happened after they reduced it to 1.25 miles was for the Breeders' Cup to step up to the plate and say, we're going to interswitch or interchange the parts, and we're going to make the Classic the $12 million race that the Gold Cup used to be. Certainly, what could be also done is that the Gold Cup could have stayed at the 1.5 miles, and then, of course, you have the Breeders' Cup at 1.5 miles. For me, for the purist, that would be an incredibly ideal situation to have 2.5 mile races. Therefore, you'd have that many more opportunities at 12 furlongs to determine who's really the best horse. Or at the least, the 1.25 miles of the Gold Cup sets up, possibly, depending on the horse and their ability and their fitness level, to go the 12 furlongs that you're ultimately going to have to tackle in the Breeders' Cup Classic. So that's a very, very good scenario in and of itself, and we have neither one going into 2019, and I don't know if anybody, this is going to move the meter enough amongst the racing executives to make a change, but I'm certainly going to lobby for that change. I think we need more 12 furlong races. At the least, the Breeders' Cup Classic should be 12 furlongs. Therefore, it would induce more 1.25 mile races. And as I've said before, the Pegasus should be 1.25 miles, and that induces more great 1.5 mile races because you have that happy medium. And the 1 1/8 races are more interesting too, because you're going to ultimately tackle the ultimate or the highest level grade ones at the 1.25 miles. And of course, we all know, depending on the field composition, dictates how strong that 1.25 miles was. And as you all know, in my Horse of the Year debate podcast, I, of course, nuanced for all of you, and along with other journalists, how strong certain grade ones are, be it at 9 furlongs, 10 furlongs, or even 1.5 miles, which again is a very, very rare fruit or a rare breed at this point in the game. Very few races carded at 1.5 miles. But for the Pegasus, at the least, this race for $12 million, even for $9 million, if it stays there and doesn't even go to the even 10 that I'm suggesting, it should be 1.25 miles. At the least, 1 3/16 to make it a little more interesting.